Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today. I've been looking forward to this for a while.
Well, so have I. Thanks for having me.
The first question I wanted to ask you was, when did you decide you wanted to pursue psychology, and how did that transform into dealing with men's issues in particular? When did you take a particular interest to that?
Well, I took an interest in psychology when I was a kid. I grew up in my father's bar. We had a truck stop restaurant bar north of Denver in an industrial area. And just watching the adults around me as a kid got me really interested. The relationships and the conflicts and all the affection and all the violence and all the tension and everything. It was really intriguing to me. So that's really when I got interested in psychology. But as far as working with men, I don't know that I really think of myself as working mainly with men, although I think that's what I do. I started off just as a clinical psychologist. I was working mainly with anxiety disorders, which is things like OCD and that sort of thing. And I started working with couples early on, and couples was really intriguing to me because it's sort of like it's like playing chess. You're trying to solve a problem. You're teaming up with these people to try to you're doing a tug of war, but you're all pulling on the same side and you're trying to solve problems and trying to get them moving down the road. And that was really intriguing and challenging work for me. But I started noticing early on that so many guys were coming through my office. And I had noticed this even before I started working with couples, that guys were coming through my office and they had just never really had any training on how to select women. It's like nobody ever sat down with them and said, hey, you can choose a woman who treats you well. You can choose a woman who's emotionally mature and who takes care of herself. There's some basic things you could look for. So many guys just don't get that training. And so that's really when I started getting interested in this problem that exists out there. And is there anything I can do about it, and helping guys make good decisions about their relationships?
Hmm. And did you yourself have that training when you when you were in the field of psychology and you were learning those things? Were you ever taught how to help men in that regard?
No. The field of psychology it used to be dominated by men. Back in the 50s and before, it was very much dominated by men. And I don't think that was a particularly good situation, because you had an exclusively male point of view for the most part. And women, before that, women were not, I don't want to say looked down upon, but they just weren't really accounted for in the way that they should have been. But that completely turned around. Now we're in the completely opposite situation, where it is absolutely dominated by women, and the male point of view is not only disregarded, but it is actively looked down upon. And so when if you're in a training program and you're taking courses on how to work with couples, for example, and you're doing some clinical supervision and you're in a practice clinic or that sort of thing, out in field placements or internships, that you're going to get very much a feminized view of what a relationship should be, meaning that we need to communicate, but we need to communicate the way women communicate. And there are a lot of good clinicians out there who understand the male point of view, but it's not taught and it's not recognized. And the professional organizations like the American Psychological Association, they seem to be actively hostile toward the male point of view and male interests. And so there's a real need out there for clinicians that know how to work with couples and work with men in particular. And some of the issues that men face get really serious. We know that something like 8 out of 10 completed suicides are men. So when men's problems take off and get real pathological, it can end in death. And so I'm starting to repeat myself, but there's a need out
No,
there
right.
for male psychology, and there are some people that are doing really good work in that field too.
And in one of your talks, I think it was the very first 21 convention that you spoke at, you had a talk where you said that you were still very optimistic about the field of psychology. And then I heard you in a podcast with on the Renaissance of Men with Will, and you said you were becoming less optimistic. What is your stance there? Do you think that this is just a transition of maybe just a period of overcorrection and things are going to get better? Or where do you see the future?
Well, I think the pendulum always swings and it goes back in a more reasonable direction eventually. But I think the reason there's a difference between that first statement and the second statement is because the American Psychological Association, between those two statements, put out their guidelines for working with boys and men. And I don't know how much detail you want to go there, but it was flat out hostile toward men. And
Yeah.
I should say it was a mixed bag. There were some good points in these guidelines for treating boys and men, but for the most part, it was a feminist screed. And when I say feminist, I don't mean the kind of feminist who believes that we're created equal and we should have equal opportunities. I'm talking about the kind of feminist that
Mm,
believes that that women should be above men and that men are contemptible.
absolutely. Um, Talking about overcorrection, there's something I wanted to discuss with you is in the whatever you want to call it, the manosphere, the masculine development space has a. Oh, I think I lost your audio. Oh, there you are.
I just muted because I had to cough there. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no worries. In the masculine development space, there's a bit of an overcorrection that I've noticed. These red pill gurus that are actually kind of mirroring what some of these radical feminists are doing. And I don't want to drop any names. I don't want to point to anyone in particular, but I've noticed that a lot of these things that they're sharing have value, but it's getting overcorrected. And the more that I was consuming this content, I noticed in myself, like, this is making me resentful towards women, right? It's making me paint all women with the same brush, and it's making me do the same things that I criticize feminism for. And I'm wondering
Yeah.
what your thoughts are, because I feel like your voice and the Tactile Guide to Women was a very balanced book. You're a very rational, reasonable voice in the space, which I appreciate. But I've noticed a lot of people aren't like that. They're very extreme, and they lack nuance in the conversation. I'm wondering what you've kind of witnessed in that regard.
Yeah, after I wrote the Tactical Guide to Women, that then I got introduced to this whole red pill community. I was completely unaware of this red pill community, but that book introduced me to this community, and I got to know some of these guys personally. And I'm like you. I think there are some good ideas. There are some important ideas, and I was really intrigued by the red pill community initially, and I still am, because they were teaching things men. They were teaching things to men that my profession should be teaching, but
Yeah.
not teaching, that's not the right word, but should be acknowledging and should be recognizing. Like, for example, that women are hypergamous in nature. That's I think factual. I think we can say that that's factual. But then, so that's a good thing for men to know. But
Yeah.
then the red pill community will take this very basic idea that women are hypergamous, and they'll build this entire theoretical framework around that idea that gets, in my estimation, very irrational. And even though there's a kernel of truth in there. And so
Hmm.
the red pill community, yeah, there are some really good ideas there. There are some vital ideas that men need to understand, I think, if they're going to be in a romantic relationship. But like you say, there's this interesting red pill subreddit out there is called X Red Pill. And these guys talk about the same thing that you're talking about, that they got drawn into this ideology. And I know that the Red Pill guys don't like it to be called an ideology, but it's an
Well,
ideology.
it
Sorry.
is. It fits the definition.
Yeah, yes, it's an ideology. They're just going to have to cope with it. They like to call it a praxeology, which is, in my estimation, just a $5 word for cherry picking. But so anyway, there's this whole subreddit out there about guys who are telling the same story you are. That, yeah, they found some useful truths, but then if you go too far down into this rabbit hole, it really does make you angry at women in a way that's just not productive. It makes people kind of paranoid about women.
Hmm.
And the troubling thing about paranoia is that when you're paranoid about something, you find a way to make it happen.
That's what I noticed in my personal life. When you're in Hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
When you're seeing things through this red pill lens, whatever you want to call it.
So
And
how did you find the red pill, and
uh,
what initially drew you to it?
I think it's probably a common story. I went through some bad relationships. I didn't have any, no one ever talked to me about masculinity. No one ever told me it was okay to have standards in a relationship. I wouldn't say I was accepting of feminism, but I was just living that kind of, modern life. I didn't really think about these ideas too deeply. Then I got burned a few times and, cheated on, lied to, and then you kind of go to the internet looking for, hey, what the hell? Like, everything I've been told about women is not necessarily correct.
Yes. Yeah. And my profession is very complicit in that. Like, that my profession has a serious problem in not recognizing that femininity has a dark side, just like masculinity has a dark side. Not to interrupt you. Sorry, go ahead.
No, no, not at all. Well, one thing that I started to get annoyed about when I was like you said, I got tons of I extracted value from the red pill stuff, but it got to a point where it's like, okay, all we're talking about is the negative aspects of female nature. We're talking about hypergamy, and it gets to the point where like there's no responsibility for the dark side of masculinity. And I'm not saying toxic masculinity. I'm saying the fact that, what's our innate biological drive. It's to spread our seed far and wide. But that doesn't mean that there isn't men who are loyal to their family and loyal to one woman. You could take the same argument. Well, all men just want to screw younger women. Well, it's like, well, yeah, well, all women want a monkey branch. It's like you could use the same. It's like they only wanted to show one. They only wanted to portray one side of the equation as negative, and it was never the man's fault. And I was like, well, that's lack of accountability.
Yeah, and I think one of the truths of humanity is that our minds are constantly divided against themselves in a million different ways. We want to approach something and we want to avoid it. Like horror movies are a great example of the mind being divided against itself. We're not supposed to be drawn toward things that evoke fear and anxiety and anger and disgust, which is all the things that horror movies evoke. And yet we go to them, we pay good money to see them. So we're in this constant tension with ourselves, and particularly in our relationships. Our motives are sometimes kind of dark at the same time that they're kind of light. And with this is particularly true with men and women. We have these competing urges. So we have an urge to be loyal, but we also have an urge to go out and spread our seed. And so with men, we're in this constant tension, and we're supposed to use our higher brains to rein in the impulses and make decisions that are consistent with our values. And it's the same with women. The desire to be secure is in conflict with the desire to explore. But again, we have cultures and we have these big brains that allow us to make choices that make our lives better, not just give into immediate gratification. So I think one of the things that the red pill might be guilty of is just forgetting that there are forces that sit in opposition to things like hypergamy.
That's a really good point. I'd actually like to go into that. You're talking about, we have these temptations and these impulses. What advice would you give to men that are dealing with that and maybe struggling with that in a committed relationship?
With impulses to, like, they want to be in a relationship, but they also want some on the side.
Yeah, that because that's I had access to porn at 14 years old. I'm 28 now. It's like we live in a culture that is so novelty based and instant gratification based that it's very tough for a lot of men to stay committed to one woman. And I'm kind of curious, like, what have you seen in your practice, and if you've had a lot of experience talking to men in this position?
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to this. I wonder if it's harder now than it has been. Because part of me says that no, we have some new technology and so forth, but temptations have always been there, and cultures always shift. So yeah, I think that, yeah, let's, for sake of argument, let's say that it's worse now than it has been. It's harder to yeah, because
I would say it's probably worse.
Yeah, I think that's not an unreasonable thing to guess about the culture. And I think one of my fundamental messages to men, I don't know if I have messages to men, but I guess if I do, this
hey,
would be one
you're
of
the
them.
voice of the patriarchy, man.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I declared myself the spokesman for the patriarchy. That if when I wrote the tactical guide to women, I'd spend a long time thinking about, what do I wish somebody had told me about getting into a relationship? And I happen to have done very well in my relationship. I chose a woman who's just she's a wonderful person, and it worked out really well for me. But I see so many that don't, and I certainly had my share of very bad relationships where I just was making ridiculous decisions. And so I was asking myself the question for years, what do I wish somebody had taught me? And what are these guys wishing somebody had taught them? Because I was asking men the same question. What do you wish somebody had taught you? And the first third of that book is about getting yourself on your purpose and your mission and knowing what it is that you're doing in life. And then you can think about who you bring on board, because if you know where you're headed, then you have a better idea of who's going to fit in your world. And so long answer to your question is it harder these days to maintain monogamy basically, and remain faithful. And I think not if you know what you're doing and why you're doing it in the world, because then you have a mission and then you can run all of your decisions through the filter of, does this fit with my mission and what I'm doing right now? And if the answer is not, if this is contrary to my values and my mission, then I'm not going to do it. That's easier when you know what your values and your mission are.
Yeah, that's correct. That's true. Um, as far as do have you talked to a lot of men who didn't really have a purpose or a mission, and they kind of made their woman their mission?
Yes.
Is that a common theme?
Yeah, it is, and you've seen it, and I've seen it.
Yeah.
And these are, it's a terrible thing. It's not good for anybody. And it's not good for her either. Like, who wants to be someone else's mission? What woman or what person, for that matter, wants to be the center of someone else's universe unless there's something going on with their character, where they're filling some need that they have, some pathological need. But yeah, it's a huge risk that if you don't know where you're going, and you happen to fall into a relationship with someone who is particularly demanding, and someone who is particularly skilled at using shame to get her needs met, for example, then it's very easy for a man to fall into a pattern of, well, I guess my purpose is just to keep her calm and keep her happy. And then she ends up miserable, and he ends up miserable, and everybody ends up miserable, because
Yeah.
that's not how it works. So how it works is you're living your life, and then you find people who are compatible with the way you're living your life. I mean, that as far as I can tell, that's how relationships function well.
There's another question I wanted to ask you about. You have a section in the Tactile Guide to Women about not dating feminist minded women. If someone's is infected by the ideology that they're oppressed,
Yeah.
they'll paint you as the oppressor eventually. And I'm not saying that my perspective is correct, but what I've witnessed in my life and what I've seen around me is that most modern women, I'm 28 years old, and most women that are my age, even Christian conservative circles, have been brainwashed into feminism to some degree. And I'm kind of wondering, like, what's your opinion on that? And also, how do men navigate? So if we're not supposed to date women that are feminist minded, how do we navigate that when it seems that all women are to some degree infected by that ideology?
Right. Yeah, it's a really good question. That is something I think that has gotten worse. And so let's define terms. In my generation, at least, I'm in my 50s. In my generation, the average person who calls himself a feminist, their definition of feminism is equal responsibility, equal rights, equal opportunities. Which, under that definition, I'm 100% a feminist. But
Yeah.
that's not the feminism that is taught on college campuses. If you look through any gender studies textbook, or if you follow any of the literature that they produce, it is very much, everything is through the lens of victim and oppressor. Men are the oppressors, women are the victims. And so you don't want to be, I would humbly submit, you don't want to be in a relationship with anybody who views themselves as a victim of everything that's going on around them, because it's inevitable. Well, number one, you're going to be constantly putting them back together and trying to take care of them and listening to all of their stories about how the world is mistreating them, and that's going to get old in about 10 seconds, unless you're really into that, because there's something going on your end that you don't want to deal with. But anyway, you don't want to be in that kind of relationship if you have anything that you're trying to accomplish in the world, because it's going to be such a major distraction. That's number one. But then the larger point is that person who has the victim mindset, they are inevitably going to see you as the bad guy, and they're going to frame you as the bad guy. And if you're not really keenly attuned to what's going on, it's very easy to just slip into that role and not question what's going on, and start to think that you're the bad guy. But whether you do or not, that's not a position you want to be in, again, if you're trying to accomplish anything in the world. So setting aside the political ideology, that's not a particularly healthy relationship dynamic. Now you add to that the fact that so many people, and not just women, but women and men, are being taught in colleges, and even before that we have this victim oppressor mentality or dynamic going on in our society. Well, now, unfortunately, you have a whole generation of people where some unreasonable percentage of them have learned that they are the victim or they are the oppressor. And so we're setting up this relationship dynamic that cannot function well. And so the answer to the question, how do you deal with it? I think, unfortunately, you really have to screen for victim mentality from the outset. And just because someone has been through college, for example, and they've had this training, doesn't mean that the training really fits for them. And if they're questioning it and they disagree with it, or they're open to discussion about it, then that's probably a good sign. Because I think you almost have to assume that nowadays every woman under the age of, I don't know under what age, maybe we'll arbitrarily say under the age of 30, they've had some of this indoctrination. Yeah. So I guess the question now is, do they buy into it? And if they buy into it, that's a no-go.
And in my experience, if they might have been downloaded some of these ideas, but as soon as you as a strong masculine man challenges them in any way, sometimes they'll test you. Like, I've met women that are more feminist minded, or they just have a few, they're not full blown, but they'll just have a few little things, and you kind of just say, no, that's ridiculous. And eventually they're like, yeah, that is ridiculous. It's sometimes weak men allow for feminists. Well, there's some meme going around where it's like weak men create strong feminists. Well, maybe the inverse is true. Strong men kind of teach women that there's a reason for the polarity.
Yeah. So I guess if you were I'm gonna riff on that a bit. I guess if you wanted to frame the current atmosphere in a positive way, that the positive is that this feminist ideology that's being shoved down everyone's throats right now, it's a good way to vet people.
Yeah.
Do they reject it? And if so, then hey, they're independent thinkers. Good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, cool. Another thing I wanted to talk about, academia has been taken over. The APA has been taken over. All these institutions, like, men have lost faith in the institutions. And that's a reason that a lot of men don't seek out therapy. How do men find psychologists such as yourself? Because for me personally, like, if I was just going to some random psychologist, I wouldn't trust them.
I wouldn't either. I think you're smart there, and I hate to hear myself say that, but I think right now it's kind of a tough time. I live in Denver, and I don't know how it is elsewhere, but there's just a shortage. Like, I know a lot of good psychologists in Denver, people that I would trust, and nobody's taking on any new clients. And I'm not really sure what's going on there. It's not COVID. People say it's COVID. I don't think it has anything to do with COVID. But basically, the good people are full up. So number one, it's setting aside the fact that my profession has been hopelessly infected with ideology. It's still just hard to find a psychologist. But I think that the answer is, you call around, you start online, you call around, you make some phone calls, and you try to have some interactions with people, and ask some questions. Like, one of the questions that I've started to suggest people to ask, and I'm looking for feedback to find out if this actually works. So I'm putting this question out there, and I'm hoping that people will get back to me with some results, is asking a potential psychologist or a therapist, what social or political issues do you think it's important to discuss with your clients? Because the reason I frame it that way is because there is this active messaging out there, like from the American Psychological Association, that therapists should be using the therapeutic relationship to advance political ideologies. I mean, they flat out said this in their guidelines for working with boys and men. Well, it's so unethical, and the APA does a lot of good work, but this is just so bizarrely unethical that it just leads me to believe that it's become a religion to them. So if you ask the question, what social issues do you believe that do you think it's important to discuss with your client? It's a trick question, because obviously the answer should be, well, I don't discuss any social issues. I'm here to work for you. We're gonna team up on your problem and see what we can come up with. But if there's anything other than, I don't bring my agenda into the clinic, if there's any answer other than that, then you can just move on immediately.
Yeah.
But then beyond that, there's some things that you should look for in that first session. If you meet with somebody, that first session should be all about trying to pin down what it is exactly that you're trying to accomplish. And you should walk out of that first session a little bit tired because it's been work. You should walk out with some kind of sense that at least the problem is more clearly framed right now. And we have some kind of an idea of how to go forward. And if you don't walk out of a first session with that feeling, Doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't go back, but that's something that you should discuss with the person if you have a good feeling about them. So, there's a couple of basic strategies for finding somebody.
Do you have a lot of peers and colleagues that you would trust? Like, do you have friends in the space that are have some of your values?
Yes, and I'll start by saying I don't bring my values into the clinic. Like what we're
Yeah,
discussing
yeah,
right now, this doesn't come into the clinic because this is
yeah.
politics, and so I don't. The APA,
Sorry.
for example, is and you're not suggesting. I know you're not
Yeah,
suggesting
yeah,
that, but the APA, for example, is saying you need to bring your leftist progressive ideology into the clinic. Well, the answer to that is not that I'm going to bring the opposite ideology. The
yeah,
answer
yeah.
to that is I'm going to be the best clinician I can be. And I know people out there, there's several people here in town that I know they're on the left, and I know, like progressive left, but they're also really good clinicians. And that tends to come with more training. Like the word therapist doesn't mean anything. It's a not a protected term, whereas the word psychologist means you have a doctorate and you have a license. So it's a very protected term. So a therapist could mean anything. Like, anybody could be a therapist. So with more training tends to come a greater ability to be a better clinician. Not always, but typically.
Cool. There's a couple of other things I wanted to talk to you about. You brought up the fact that this could relate to a lot of men's issues with the red pill community and stuff like that. But we tend to, I can't remember the specific quote, but it was something like, we focus on the train wrecks. We focus on the really negative relationships we see, ignoring the planes that land safely every day.
Mm-hmm.
So there's tons of relationships that are going on around us that are healthy, vibrant, they're good.
Yeah.
But every time something negative happens, we're like, see, marriages suck. And I do this in my own life where it's almost like I am conditioned to seek out the negative in relationships. I don't know by what mechanism and why that's happened to me. And I'm more awake to it now.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like, like I've seen a lot of these red pill guys that I'll see on social media. They're posting Will Smith and his relationship, and this is what happens when you get married, and blah blah blah. It's like, that's irrational because you're using one case study and trying to paint marriage that way. I guess my question is to you: why are we wired? Is that a natural thing? Like, are we
Yeah.
supposed to be wired to see the negatives?
100%. Yeah, we have a negativity bias. And
Yeah.
it's been really well documented in reliable research that we seem to be built so that if we hear a rustling in the bushes, we don't assume it's a bunny rabbit. We assume it's a lion because that's the safer bet. And so it just shows up in all of our perceptions. Like if you imagine that you walk into a cathedral and you see this beautiful stained glass window, like the most ornate thing you've ever seen. And the colors are brilliant and it's just beautifully crafted and it's delicate and it's wonderful. But down in the corner, there's a missing piece. Just one tiny little pane of glass is missing. Where does your mind go? Like your eye just locks in on that missing piece. That's just what we do. And unfortunately, there's a lot of guys out there that, like you say, they're talking about the train wrecks or the plane crashes. They're not talking about the thousands of flights. We have thousands of airline flights every day. They all land safely until one of them doesn't, and then we focus in on that, which we should. We need to look at that. But these guys, some of them, I think that to give them the benefit of the doubt, I don't know that they are seeing their own negativity bias. If I wanted to give a less charitable explanation, it would be that they make money by talking about the train wrecks, just like CNN and Fox makes money by talking about the train wrecks. But I'll be charitable and say that they probably just aren't seeing their negativity bias and they lock in on the train wreck and that's all they can talk about. And that says to me that, if a person's doing that and we're being charitable about their motivations, it probably suggests that they have been traumatized and trauma, that word is so overused, but they've had some bad experiences. They haven't come to terms with those bad experiences. And so they're just spreading it around.
Mm-hmm. And there's definitely an addiction to fear porn that comes with that as well.
Yeah.
Outrage sell, fear sells. To go into that though, like talking about train wrecks, what are some common patterns you see in relationships that fail? Like, is it really all chalked up to hypergamy, or is that or is that on like the bottom of the list?
Hypergamy is absolutely the bottom of the list. Like there's it's been well studied by good, reliable epidemiological data why relationships end. And I don't, yeah, I'm not going to be able to recite the causes in order like I should be able to.
Oh
I'm
yeah.
a little
Yeah.
embarrassed by that, but it's things like money problems, infidelity, the inability to argue constructively, substance abuse. You know, people out there talking about hypergamy like it ends relationships. Hypergamy comes into play when women are choosing relationships. It is, I've never, well, one time I've seen hypergamy as the clear cause of the end of a relationship, but I've seen a lot of, heard a lot of tales about divorces and worked with hundreds of couples. Hypergamy, it just isn't there as a cause for the end of a relationship. But substance abuse, something like substance abuse, good Lord, it's like leaves on the trees. It's everywhere. So if you want to do an order of operations, what are we going to talk about? Are we going to talk about the big problems before the small problems? The big problems are things like alcoholism. That ends a lot of relationships. The inability to have an argument like a grown up, that ends a lot of relationships. Sexual incompatibility, difficulties over money, like disagreements about what money should be used for, that kind of thing.
One question, I just for clarity, when you say infidelity, do you think that stems from hypergamy, or would you say that, when it comes to infidelity, what are the main causes for someone to stray as far as what you've seen?
Main causes is they're not getting something that they want at home. And I think I'm not here to, I don't want to beat up on the red pill guys too much because I do
Oh
think
yeah.
most of them are trying to do something good. And I know you're not trying to beat up on them either, but it's hard not to talk about the way they talk about things. And I think they see all instances of female infidelity as monkey branching. Like she's looking for the bigger, badder alpha. Or, that's not how they would say it, but they would talk
Yeah.
about monkey branching, and they would talk about optimizing hypergamy, meaning that she's got somebody at home, but she could do better, and that women are constantly scanning the social environment for the next better thing. And in my experience, I'm just one clinician, but usually when somebody steps outside the marriage, it's because they would prefer to be in the marriage, but there's something there that is missing, or it has become so oppressive that they feel almost pushed out of the marriage.
Mm,
Like women tend to be like, once women marry, they tend to be they 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 like that security. Why wouldn't they? They're human beings, and they
yeah.
tend to want to stay married. They don't want to, I guess, to buy into the hypergamy framework, you have to believe that women just willy nilly will disrupt their families, disrupt their reputation, disrupt their children, throw the entire family into disarray, throw their lives and their professional lives into disarray because they want a monkey branch. And that just doesn't make sense to me. It's not what I've seen.
Yeah, cool, cool. Yeah, I've gathered that as well, just from my own experience, and also just the more I learn about evolutionary psychology, it's like, well, that doesn't the whole hypergamy is always the problem, doesn't really add up.
Yeah. Now, the red pill guys, I'll argue on their behalf for a minute. They will say that there are studies out there that say that women have a plan B in their mind, meaning that they have given thought to what they might do if this relationship falls apart.
Yeah.
And I think I've read that research, and I find it to be compelling that yeah, women, it does appear to be the case that women will sometimes think about, okay, what would I do if things fell apart here? Who's my plan B? And they might have someone in particular in mind, a
Mm,
fantasy husband that's in their circle that they know personally. So yes, that exists, but there's a huge difference between what somebody fantasizes about and what they would actually do.
yeah.
And conditional in most of that research is, if the relationship ends, what would I do? Not, I'm going to end the relationship so that I can do this. Very different,
Hmm.
completely different approach to things.
There's a book, I can't remember the author's name, but it's called The Evolution of Desire. Have you ever heard of that book?
I have heard of it. I haven't read it. So yeah.
Yeah, it has research in it and studies, and they talk about women's dual mating strategy. Do you buy into that? Is that a real thing?
Yeah, I think it is. The dual mating strategy, as I understand it, is that women are drawn to two different kinds of men. They're drawn to the man who is the Giga Chad, who's
Yeah, the alpha.
yeah, but that guy's not really great at relationships typically, so they're also drawn to the guy who's more reliable. I guess we'd call this a beta. I hate these terms alpha and beta because they're so reductionistic and they don't really mean anything, because
Hmm.
where a man might be beta in one situation, he's alpha in another. We're very fluid about alpha and beta. But anyway, they would say that the woman wants the alpha to inseminate her. I don't want to be crude here, but then she wants the beta to settle down with. So she wants to cuck the beta with
Mm.
the alpha's seed. Again, where's the data? I mean, you can certainly point to cases. You can point to a million cases. You can find a million stories of someone who did precisely that, but that doesn't mean that's what the population in general does.
I also don't see why it isn't possible that a man embody both. You know,
Mm-hmm.
why can't a man be strong, alpha, dominant, but also reliable?
Well, I think that's the man who is successful
Yeah,
in the
integrated.
mating arena. Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Integrated. Good word.
So another thing I wanted to ask you is as far as having expectations in a relationship, healthy expectations, what can men expect to get out of marriage, out of long-term relationships? Because I think that sometimes are we expecting too much? You know, when we make a woman our focus, we want her to be our purpose, our mission. But like, what can we expect, and what should we like? Even when it comes to conflict, how much conflict is too much, and how like if there's no conflict, there's an issue too. Like, what's the balance there, and what can we expect?
That's a really interesting question. I've never thought about that question. How much conflict is too much?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
good.
asking
Yeah,
for a friend.
yeah. And I don't know why I've never. I mean, that's brilliant that you phrase it that way, because it's a question that everybody wrestles with. Like when you talk to somebody who's trying to decide if they're going to stay in a relationship, or that's the question that they're wrestling with. So yeah, that's brilliant. I don't know the answer how much is too much, because there's so many other variables that come into play. Like, are there kids involved? Are you married? Are
Mm,
you not married? I can say that the earlier you recognize it, the better. And you want to recognize it before you have developed a lot of entanglements. Like, I'm very big about people not moving in together, not getting a puppy together, not getting a lease or sharing a car, doing any of those things until they are well past the infatuation phase. Because when you're
mm.
in that infatuation phase, you're not seeing the person very clearly. So you want to get past that phase and then have an extended period of time where you're actually seeing them clearly. So where do we start with the question? Sorry.
Well,
What
the
can you
question:
expect?
what are healthy expectations in a relationship? How much conflict is too much?
Yeah.
And also, you just said the infatuation phase. How long is that typically? To me, like, is that a year and a half
There
usually?
has been some research looking at serotonin signatures in cerebral spinal fluid, I believe, that being a very sloppy proxy for
Yeah.
the fact that when you're infatuated, your brain chemistry changes.
Hmm.
Obviously, because if we change, our chemistry changes, and if our
You're high.
chemistry changes, we
You're
change.
pretty much high.
Yeah, you're pretty much high. You're under the influence. You're not seeing her clearly. You're not seeing yourself clearly. You're not presenting yourself honestly. You're not seeing her honestly. Everything is idealistic and wonderful. And the research I've seen says anywhere between 6 and 18 months that can last. And then the brain starts going back to its baseline. And
Hmm.
that's when you actually can start vetting the person. And some ways to recognize when that's happening, since you're probably not getting your cerebral spinal fluid measured, is when that person starts to become more three dimensional to you, and the little things that you used to find very endearing, now you're starting to notice that they're also a little bit irritating. So it's lovely that she spends so much time putting herself together before you go out, but then
It's
eventually
annoying.
you start to notice that it's kind of annoying because now because it makes her late. So when that three dimensionality starts to come back into the picture, that's a pretty good indication that you're coming out of the infatuation stage.
Hmm. I've definitely had experiences where I have been in the infatuation stage and allowed myself to become entangled, and then real
Mm-hmm.
once you come down off the love drugs, love drug, you start to realize, oh, I made mistakes when I was under the influence.
Do you mind, and tell me if it's none of my business, but
Oh
what
yeah,
kind of entanglements?
moving in,
Okay.
after like 6 months.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And then after that, like the relationship that I'm currently in, we were dating for 2 years, and I already understood what the infatuation phase felt like. I knew I was well out of it, and I still waited another year. And now we are living together
Mhm.
after 2 years, but I was able to recognize,
Yeah.
uh, what that felt like.
So now
And
you're making an informed choice instead of a hormonal choice.
yes,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's the right choice necessarily, but I was not under the influence when I made it.
Yeah. Well, right or wrong, you weren't under the influence. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. At least you're better informed than you would have been.
And as far as we'll go into the conflict thing, how how much conflict is too much? I guess you said you couldn't really tell me that.
Well, I can talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question because it's just never occurred to me to quantify it. But in this, I'm working on another book, and I'm talking about the quality of the relationship. What do you look for in the qualities of the relationship? And one of the things that a relationship should bring to a man's life and to her life too is a sense of composure. Like you should, if you're walking into a stressful meeting at work with a client or a boss or an attorney or whatever, you should walk in knowing that whatever you've got going on at home makes you a little bit stronger rather than a little bit weaker. And I
Mm,
think maybe that's a proxy answer for the question is if you're going through your life and you have the sense that this relationship is actually weakening you a little bit because it's bringing so much crap into your world that maybe that's too much. And I think that, now, as I'm talking about it, I think it probably is a pretty clear dividing line that a guy could recognize pretty easily. Yeah, this relationship is a soft place to land. It's making me stronger. Or this relationship is a hard place to land
mm.
and it's making me weaker.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense. Um, yeah. So you want the relationship to not drain you of energy, to give you energy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And
these
that's
relationships exist. And I think going back to the question, the thing you brought up earlier about infidelity is that I think when things are going well and you have that relationship that you actually look forward to going home to, then the chances of infidelity go down quite a bit because you're just not, you're happy, you're satisfied.
another question I wanted to ask that's kind of in line with the whole how much conflict should there be or not be is a lot of people will tell me, it should be a fuck yes or a fuck no when it comes to relationships or committing to a relationship. But in your experience, is it normal to have doubts?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, if you don't
Yeah.
have some doubts, you're not thinking about it, I think.
Okay. Yeah. Because I'm like,
Yeah.
well, and then there's a part of me that you talk a lot about in one of your talks. I can't remember which specific one it was, but you talk about, follow your intuition, follow that gut feeling. But I if there's ever been a time where you've trusted your intuition, or maybe you just, followed that gut feeling, like I'm going to do this, and then you got burned by it. Sometimes I know from my own experience that it's almost hard you got to kind of rebuild the trust with your own intuition after you've done that.
Yeah.
Do you get
Yeah.
follow?
Yeah, I can. You want to talk about intuition for a minute because I have some thoughts here.
Yeah, totally.
That I do say listen to intuition, but there's a subtlety there. So let me back up for a minute. Let's define terms. What is intuition? And guys kind of struggle with intuition because we're not really taught to be attuned to it. We're typically taught, if you're raised by men, you're taught to rub some dirt on it and keep going in life. And that's a really good skill. You got to have the ability to rub some dirt on it and keep going. But the cost is that if that's the only thing you're doing, then you're not being attuned to all the information that you could be paying attention to from your mind and your body. And so if we think of intuition not as some kind of mystical thing, because I think that's the way some people try to think about it, and
Mhm.
that's
Yeah.
not comfortable for me, and I think it's not comfortable for a lot of guys because I need something a little more concrete, and a more concrete way to think about it is as simply as nonverbal information processing. And there's been some really good papers I've talked about in some of my books, but there's been some really good papers that quantify what is this thing called intuition. Well, it's essentially nonverbal parts of your brain speaking to you nonverbally because they're nonverbal. And we tend to think, if you're a typical guy, I think you tend to think very verbally or very visually. And you tend to not pay attention so much to the nonverbal indications. Like, so what would your mind be? So what's an example of your brain speaking to you non-verbally? Well, it's losing sleep over something. It's getting that feeling in your stomach, or just being
Yeah.
tight, or just being irritable and crabby and tense. That could be a lot of things, but it could also be your mind
I
talking to you.
I've gotten that. I've gotten that quite a bit. That
The
feeling where it's like physical manifestation of
Yeah.
nonverbal. It's like a alarm bell.
Yes.
Something's going on. It could be like a headache, or you just feel sick, sleep issues, stuff like that. So I totally relate to that.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly the most useful way to think about it. It's an alarm bell. Now,
Mhm.
alarm bell doesn't mean there's a fire. An alarm bell means stop and pay attention. Like a little dashboard dummy light on a car. They don't
Mhm.
have those so much anymore, but in the older cars, you just had a light that would say check engine. I guess they still have those. And you don't know what that means. It just means, so what it means is stop, slow down, pay attention. Let's ask some questions here. So my stance when I say listen to your intuition is don't assume that it's right and don't assume that it's wrong. Just
Mhm.
stop and start
Yeah.
asking some questions and putting words to this nonverbal information that you're getting.
Mhm. So intuition is not the final say. It's just something that's kind of, you talked about when you worked with anxiety disorders, OCD, stuff like the social
Mm-hmm.
anxiety. A lot of like that. That's people were probably having those physical symptoms, alarm bells going off, but it
Yeah.
was it was for no reason. It was almost like autoimmune, but for the brain. Like the alarm systems were just going off.
Yeah, that's a brilliant way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, we've kind of gone through all the stuff that I had written down for today. There's one other thing I don't know if you want to talk about this, but as a psychologist, what is your take on the current state of affairs when it comes to the pandemic and everything going on? Is
As a
it
psychologist.
like as like
Yeah.
as someone who knows the human brain and
Yeah.
knows social anxiety and all these things, like what do you see playing out on the global scale?
I see a lot of irrationality, and I like the way you phrase that as a psychologist, because I'm usually very careful to separate my clinical opinion from my
Yeah,
personal opinions, and so
yeah.
I appreciate that phrasing. Um, as a psychologist, I see a lot of hysteria going on
Mhm.
about this thing. So, for example, today apparently Joe Biden has mandated that everyone is going to get the vaccine if you want to have a job,
Mhm.
and my personal opinion of that is that's very authoritarian.
Yeah.
But my professional opinion of that is I just spoke to somebody who's in this position where they potentially could lose their job, and which would be horribly destructive to people who work for him and for the people in his family. And this person has natural immunity. So
Yeah.
a
It's
person who has
irrational.
natural immunity is now required to get a shot that he doesn't want to get so that he can keep his job. That to me is an irrational fear. That says to me that we are gripped by something here that is not logical.
Mhm. And do you think that an absence of masculinity has kind of led up to this?
Yes. I'm sorry. Go ahead, finish your question.
But yeah, it's like this everything I see playing out in the world, the fact that authoritarianism is, in my opinion, running rampant. I see that happening because of, and I'm not trying to be like, I'm not trying to engage in the fear porn and say, we're going into communism. I'm just saying there's a lot of things going on right now where if masculinity was present and healthy,
Mhm.
wouldn't really be able to, tyranny wouldn't really be able to flourish if men were being men.
I agree with that 100%. If you think about a two-parent family, a mother and a father, there are other arrangements that can work just fine, but you have a mother and a father raising children. What the mother tends to bring to that is affection first and structure second, which is, I'm not saying structure is conditional on affection. I'm just saying
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
she's likely to prioritize affection and safety over structure. And the father is more likely to prioritize structure and discipline over safety. So the
Mm,
father typically, not always, but the father, because sometimes this is reverse, but the father is typically the one who will let Junior climb around on the monkey bars and get hurt because he understands, even if he hasn't put words to it, he understands that I need my child to engage with risk here so that he can get hurt in a place where he's not going to get hurt badly so that he doesn't grow up into an adult who has no idea what his limits are, and then he gets hurt in a spectacularly destructive fashion. So
Mhm.
fathers are typically the ones that will say, we need a little risk, we need a little dirt, we need a little danger. And that is what seems to be missing from this equation. We've gone so far into, not all of us, but there's a contingent in America and in Europe at least that has gone all the way into safety at all costs, which turns out to be really dangerous
Mhm. Yeah,
in my estimation. And that's a very feminine mindset, I think, safety at all costs.
I'm up in Canada, and it's probably even worse than what's. Well, I don't know. I'm not sure what it's like in the States. Every state's a little different, but
Yeah.
in Canada, pretty much unless you're self-employed or working for a specific business that's not following the mandates, you have to get jabbed or you lose your job.
Right.
Yeah, it's safety over everything up here. So yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to think about it on the micro scale of a family, and then that's exactly if you look at the macro and what that looks like in a government as a government policy. Yeah, it's a
Mm-hmm.
very feminine policy to make safety the
Yeah.
be all end all.
And we need both. We need the masculine and the feminine, but
Yeah,
we are
absolutely.
way out of balance right now,
Hmm.
in my opinion.
So, what do you think? This can be a good way to wrap this all up. What do you think needs to happen for the balance to be struck? Like over the next 10 to 20 years, next 50 years, like where are we going if this where are we going if the balance doesn't if we don't find the balance, and what do we need to do on an individual level and a
Yeah.
societal level to make the balance happen?
We could turn it around in 5 minutes if we would just start saying no to some of these people. Like, I'll give you an example of me saying no recently. The American Psychological Association, I like to yell at them. They ignore me, but I have fun yelling at them. They recently put out an apology for racism. So they were apologizing on behalf of psychology for
Yeah, I saw that.
racist tendencies that the field of psychology has had in the past. And the field of psychology has had some racist behaviors in the past. There's no disputing that. But these people didn't do it. The ones that are apologizing, that are crafting this thing, they didn't do anything racist, and I didn't do anything racist. And so they're apologizing on my behalf. And my response to them on Twitter was, hey, don't apologize for me because I'm not racist. So don't
Mhm.
do that. And I'm just one tiny little voice. But if enough of us would start saying, no, that's enough. I'm not accepting your apology on my behalf. I'm not going to take the jab. I'll go work somewhere else. If we would just bring in a little bit of that masculine energy and say, no, enough, knock it off. And
Do you ever do you ever worry about like as a psychologist, do you ever worry about disciplinary action they can take against you, revoke your license, anything like that?
nah, fuck them. What are they going to do to me? Sorry, am I allowed to cuss here?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. The American Psychological Association, they're a governing body. You don't have to be a member of their
Mm,
organization, and I'm not a member. I refuse to give them money because it's like giving money to a radical cult at this point. But the only way they could make life difficult for me is if they come to Colorado, or somebody in Colorado who's involved in licensing starts to pick up on what I'm saying, and then they go after my license. And that happened to a friend of mine, that he was speaking out in a way that some
mm,
anonymous people lodged a complaint with the state, and the state takes these complaints very seriously. And so he could have lost his license because these anonymous people complained. And I don't want to say I want that to happen, but I don't fear that happening at all.
yeah, we need more people to have that courage to speak out despite potentially,
Yeah.
yeah, that's awesome. Great to hear. Thank you very much for coming on, man. I appreciate you taking the time to do this with me today.
Well, it was fun. I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, look, I enjoyed I wasn't aware of you until you contact me, which is unfortunate because you have some really good interviews. I went back and listened to some of your interviews. So yeah,
Yeah,
I hope you go big places with this.
yeah, I'm very new to podcasting and communicating in this way, so I appreciate it. If you can just let everybody know where they can find you online, that'd be great.
I have a website called ironshrink.com where you can find me there, and I'm on Twitter at ironshrink.
Awesome, man. And you said you're working on a new book. Do you know when that's going to be released?
No, I don't. I'm
It's going to
taking
be,
my time with it.
yeah, it's going to be quite a few years, probably. I
Uh,
can
I would hope less than two.
listen to.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great to hear. Well, I really appreciate you coming on. You have a great rest of your day, man.
All right, you too.